Well, everybody, welcome to today's Data Science Education webinar. Today is April 3rd, and this webinar is being made available through the Concord Consortium, which is a nonprofit education technology laboratory based in Concord, Massachusetts. We're also in Emeryville, California. You can learn more at our website, concord.org/meetup. I'd love to introduce you to our facilitator today, Kim Castuns, who is a special research scientist at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory of Columbia University. She's also one of our board members at the Concord Consortium, which makes things very exciting for us. Kim has spent most of her research at Lamont Doherty, and her career goals have ranged from founding a master's degree program for environmental journalists to helping to fund the Oceans of Data Institute at EDC. And during today's webinar, Kim will be sharing her work with us about questions students generate as they view data visualizations. A recorded version of this webinar will be made available on YouTube. We will email you details about it through Eventbrite after the event. If you're comfortable sharing your name and face, please turn on your web camera during the webinar event so that we can see you. I'd also like to emphasize that the format of this webinar is participatory by design, which means that we'll work together to decide conversations and connections and activities that we want to discuss today. I'll go ahead and facilitate the questions that you have on Zoom, and also if you want to give some in-person live questions as well, Kim will be fielding that. For those of you who are just joining us, welcome to our webinar. Our speaker is Kim Castuns, who will be speaking about the questions that students generate as they view data visualizations. Kim, I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you all for coming. Something. You cannot share screen while other participant is sharing.
Who else is sharing the screen?
Yeah, you'll have to, I'm sharing.
Somebody else is sharing.
Okay.
Oh, no, we're good now. Okay. So, in theory,
All right.
you should be seeing my PowerPoint. Yes, beautiful. Okay, so.
I don't know if you want to move that out of your way.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
So what kinds of questions do students generate as they explore data visualizations? I have two collaborators on this work. Margie Turin is on the call with us. She's an education coordinator also at Lamont Doherty Earth Observatory and was involved in developing the app that provides the data that the students have access to in this project. And Melissa Strada will also be joining the call. She was a doctoral student at Teachers College when she worked on the project with us now. She's now at the College of New Jersey, a brand new assistant professor in integrative STEM education. And she's thinking about how to apply these ideas to disciplines outside of geosciences. We also have Stephanie Fearman on the call today. She was the principal investigator of the large climate change education partnership that this project was nestled within. So the tool that we used is called the Polar Explorer. At the time that we used it, it was an iPad app. It provides students access to publicly available vetted data. All the data are presented in the form of map-style visualizations. And there's 64 different types of data. It all has something to do in some way with either sea level change, the impacts of sea level change, or climate change, particularly in polar regions. The data include both natural science data and social science. And in the iPad version, you have access to zoom in on the data, and there's info pages which can tell you about the source of the data and some about how the data was interpreted. You have access in some of the data to changes over time. For example, how has the temperature changed over time since we started measuring it? And in some of the data types, you have access to variation with depth. And if you're interested in looking at this, you can download it from this URL. So the plan for today is I'm going to introduce this research study with a particular focus on why would anybody want to study student question asking. Then I'm going to have you generate some questions yourselves from the same two of the data types that the students had access to in our study. And then we're going to code some of your questions using the taxonomy that we developed in the study. So the first thing we had to do in order to move forward on this question was develop a set of terminology, a vocabulary for talking about what kinds of questions do students generate. So we'll do that interactively in the middle of the webinar. Then I'll tell you some about the findings from our study. And then finally, we'll have a conversation at the end about how to help students develop both the ability, the capacity, and the habit of mind of generating more questions and better questions as they explore data. Are we good? Technological? Okay. Okay, so why would we want to study this question? Why study student-generated questions? The first set of reasons have to do with the role of question asking in the nature of science. So asking questions is a fundamental practice of science. So as part of our job as science educators, helping students develop this skill is part of our mission. If you're working in a next generation's, an NGSS adopting area, asking questions is practice number one of the NGSS. For scientists, a good question is the starting point for research. And even if you're not going to become a scientist, for everyone, having free-flowing questions opens the door to becoming a self-directed, lifelong learner who can pursue inquiries and find answers even after you're out of the formal education setting. From the other perspective, the students' questions provide a window into what do these students care about? What are they curious about? What do they not understand? How skillful are they at formulating scientist-like inquiries when they come into an unfamiliar domain through the door of data? Now, it turns out this is a data set from the Right Question Institute, and the horizontal axis is age, and the vertical is percentage of children actively using various skills. So as students go through the formal education system, their use of reading skills and writing skills ramps up. However, their use of question-asking skills, according to this data set, ramps down. So those of you who are parents are familiar with this peak where preschoolers ask question after question after question, why? For those of you who have taught college, you may know that at the far right-hand end of this image, it's very hard to pull questions forth from college students. So that ramping down of the skill of asking questions is something that we've experienced, and it would be nice if we could figure out how to push back against that. So this study doesn't get us all the way to there, but it gives us some tools to think about how we could make progress in that direction. So our research questions in the study were, first of all, how can we characterize the kinds of questions that students ask? What factors influence the nature of the kinds of questions that students generate as they explore these data visualizations? And does the activity of generating questions increase how engaged students are either around data or their attitudes towards using data for various purposes? So all of these questions were asked in a very focused sort of way in our study. We looked at one particular kind of data, we looked at one particular population, but these questions are all generalizable and they could apply to other kinds of data and other ages and other contexts. So in our study, we varied the stimulus, which is to say the map set, the set of maps. So if they didn't look at just a single map, they had access to a whole group of maps that covered one of two different topics. The first set of maps had to do with why does sea level change? So we gave them maps about ocean temperature and ice and atmospheric temperature and so on and so forth. That set of maps were mostly natural science maps. The second set of maps had to do with who is vulnerable to changes in sea level. So that set of maps included social science data like human population, as well as natural science data sets such as where do hurricanes occur and other storms with greater and lesser frequency. We also varied the prompt, the directions with which we elicited our questions. So the first prompt we used was basically your task is to write down as many questions as you can about what you're seeing. And that was motivated by this book called Make Just One Change, which is a volume of practitioners' wisdom of how to encourage students to ask questions and then how to help them learn to high grade the questions that they have asked. So that was our first prompt. The second prompt was, imagine you're going to have a chance to meet the scientists who collect this data, write down the questions that you would like to ask those scientists. So this was motivated by ask a question websites where you can type in your question and some science organization will find a scientist to answer those questions for you. And during the interactive part of today's webinar, you'll get to answer questions in response to both of those prompts and an example from each of our two map sets. And then finally, we varied the level of interactivity. So there was an interactive version where the students used the iPad app to access the maps. And then, as the comparison, we made a paper atlas. Actually, Melissa Zrada, our student, made a paper atlas. This is the paper atlas. And basically, it's got the same maps in it that were available in the iPad app, but they're static. For each data type, typically we would show a global map, and then on the subsequent pages there would be either a zoomed in map of a particularly interesting area, or in cases where you could go backwards in time.
Is always doing behind the in.
So there's somebody who's not muted right now.
Standing flat-footed with they're on the balls of the feet.
So we're hearing somebody else's voice other than mine.
You can mute, I'll mute probably.
I went ahead and muted.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. Anyway, so we had these two different versions, the iPad version and the paper version. The paper version, we tried to simulate some of the kinds of interactivity by, in subsequent pages, showing either a zoomed-in map or a map that came from a different time or a different water depth. So we compared those two conditions. Okay, so our work, our research project was added onto an existing project, and so we piggybacked our data collection on an already planned evaluation of the iPad app itself. So the format was there were preliminary evaluation questions, which were common across the entire climate change education project, including other products other than the iPad app, that talked about things like knowledge of climate change, views about climate change, and then we added strategies for persuading a friend towards your view of climate change. And then they did our activity, and then there were follow-up evaluation questions. And so there were 4 conditions. So 2 conditions asked questions, and 2 conditions did not ask questions. Within the question asking group, 1 condition had the iPad app, and 1 condition had the paper atlas. And the students were all undergraduates. They were recruited from a whole range of different colleges and universities in the general Cambridge area. The data collection took place at the evaluator's office. And so we had 41 question-generating students and 26 not question-generating students. And they were from a wide range. They were from all majors, about half STEM majors and half non-STEM majors, equally split by gender, all 4 grades of undergraduates. So it was a very diverse group of people as far as their interests, their knowledge of the topic, so that we could get an evaluation of the iPad app, as well as cast a broad net for all kinds of questions. People who care a lot about science, people who don't care about science, people who know about climate change, people who don't know about climate change. Okay, so what we're going to do now is you're going to change your role from being a webinar participant to playing the role of a participant in our study temporarily. And you're going to have a chance to ask questions. You'll ask your questions by typing in the chat. Oh, the chat is already over here. Mostly people saying hello. So there'll be 2 options. So then I'll introduce the the vocabulary, the taxonomy that we developed to think about what kinds of questions do people ask. And we'll try coding some of your questions. You can try coding some of your questions. There'll be two options. One is not interactive and very simple. I will show you maps one at a time on the Zoom window. You will answer questions according to the prompt that I will also give you. The second option is more complicated, but possibly more interesting, especially for people who are interested in technology and education. You open another browser window and go to the Polar Explorer website at this URL. I will steer you to two specific maps by telling you which menu item to select. In the interactive version, the web version, which is similar to what the students used in our study. They had the iPad version. You'll be working on the web version, but the interactivity is similar. So you'll have access to Zoom, Pan, click for data value at a specific point, and a link that will take you to further information by clicking on the little eye symbol. In either case, you type your questions into the Zoom chat in response to a prompt that I gave you.
Just want to make sure the Zoom chat is set to everyone so everyone can see it.
Yeah.
But I mean, yours is, but for other people typing.
Okay.
Yeah.
Are there questions about how we're going to do this interactive part? Okay, well, let's try. So our first prompt, you'll have a chance to respond to each of the two prompts that our students responded to. Our first prompt is, today's activity has to do with asking questions about data. As you look at the map, your task is to write down as many questions as you can about what you're seeing. And here's option one. So option one, you just look at the map that's here in the Zoom window and write questions in response to the prompt. Option two, you go to this URL and then follow. When you get to the URL, there will be a place for new users. You don't need to go there because that's just the tutorial. Instead, you click your way down through the menus through who is vulnerable, then who is in the path of hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones, then tracks of past hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones, and you should end up with a map that looks like the one that's in the Zoom window. Let's see, I guess I would like to see some thumbs up or some indication that this is working before I move on. Okay, there's some thumbs up. Okay, excellent. Well, I'm going to read the prompt again because I don't want to go back because I don't want to take the option one picture away. So the prompt here is, today's activity has to do with asking questions about data. As you look at the map, your task is to write down as many questions as you can about what you're seeing. And I will start looking at the chat over here, looking for questions about this map.
I didn't bring a computer. Very
Do you want to go get a computer?
I've got all these questions. I don't have a computer.
Yeah, you can go get a computer.
Do you want to look on with me?
Yeah.
I'm doing it.
You've got yours.
Just the simple option. Just look.
I'll come around and look and see what your questions are, but I brought a computer to a webinar.
Should have put that in the directions. We might not have thought that part through. Oh, this is fun, actually. There's lots of great questions here.
Are we supposed to say which option here when we put
No, not necessary. Everybody's looking at the same data set, so.
At the equator. because it can't figure out which way to go. Because this way in the northern hemisphere, this way in the southern hemisphere, in the middle, it doesn't know which way to go. One way to say that there's no Coriolis force. But,
There's so
why
much I
is there
don't
so
know.
much up here? Look at that.
Yeah,
Rita and Paul, we can hear you working pretty intensely.
that is what, China? Yeah.
Europe gets clobbered and China gets clobbered.
Oh, no, this is more the US. Europe is there.
Oh, come on. That's not Europe, that's
That's the
Caribbean.
US. There's South America, so this is going all the way up
Southern Europe.
to Canada. But it's mostly in the ocean. Now let's look at the colors.
The red is a bad one.
Purple is even worse. Oh, I don't see much purple. Bigger.
Reading people's questions provokes more questions.
That's good. That's actually an interesting point.
I like that though.
At the end, we'll revisit the question of how can we encourage people to ask more questions, and that seems to be a first answer to that, is that reading other people's questions provokes more questions.
Why is there nothing down here in South America?
Yeah, somebody asked that. Actually.
Yeah,
Why no storm in the west?
yeah, it's not.
Because of South America. Yeah. It's like this is actually.
Paul, do you have any questions?
Yeah, well, that and this are the same, but why not?
What?
I was asking Paul if he had any questions to put in.
Hmm?
If
We
you have
sort
any-
of put some in
okay.
together,
Okay.
Yeah, I don't have a machine.
but you're welcome to do.
Well, that's okay, no, you can type it.
Yeah, I can type. You say the
I
question.
don't think I have any questions other people don't already have, but.
Yeah.
Just interesting. So bizarre.
It's just, isn't it
So-
symmetrical? I guess the word is symmetrical.
Yeah.
Peter out.
I think it's going under. Africa should plunk down there on top of it. It's so. It doesn't.
Is that hotter and more arid than anyone else?
So strange. I don't get it.
Mexico is pretty hot and arid.
Because you can look at other things over land, there's friction. There's more friction than only one.
Mm.
And only one, there's only evaporation and so forth, which gives it more energy.
Maybe there's some limit of
There's land under there.
water under here.
Very strange. This southern hemisphere is very different from the northern hemisphere.
Do you want to see one of these? Do you want to?
No, I'm fine.
Okay. Well, this is really entertaining. I'm loving these questions. This is really fabulous. I'm going to go to another image.
Maybe
Are
if
you
you
going to
get
add these?
the graph extended where the questions dive down, maybe they dive back up if you got a little older, given the current average age here.
That is a really good point. I actually think that it has occurred to me previously that the low point of curiosity over the human lifespan is undergraduate age. Basically, you get, little kids are very curious, and so are young animals, like kittens and puppies are very curious. Other young mammals are very curious. And then curiosity dies off and it hits a low at about age 18 or so. And then in some people it ramps back up again, and in some people it never ramps back up again. And people who come to work at a place like Concord Consortium are the people that it ramps back up again. So anyway, that was kind of a side issue, and I have no data whatsoever to bear on that other than life experience. But I do think that this is a fabulous group of questions that has emerged here. So we have great question askers here. My other data example is equally fascinating. So I'm going to switch to the other data example here. And we'll be using a different prompt here. As you look at this next map, imagine that you're going to meet the scientists who collected the data. Write down questions that you would like to ask those scientists. So here's our next map, option 1. Which you can look at in the Zoom window, and here is our option 2. You go to the same URL starting place. If you're already in there, you can get back there by hitting the menu button and then back, and that will bring you to the place that says choose a topic. And then you'll follow down the menus through why does sea level change? What is the role of the atmosphere, temperature change over the last 5 years? And you should have a map that looks like the map in the Zoom window. And once again, I'll read the prompt. As you look at the map, imagine that you're going to meet the scientists who collected the data. Write down questions that you would like to ask those scientists.
It's a bizarre map. Crazy.
Data can be crazy.
Do you know the answers to these questions?
Do I know the answers to the questions?
Yeah.
Very few of them.
Oh.
So no, but actually, I do know answers. I'm looking at the questions that are here.
You do know you can't leave till you answer all of the questions.
No, I know answers to some of them, but it's when you come to Earth data, it's a lot easier to ask questions than it is to answer them.
Yep.
That may be true of all kinds of data, but I can say with confidence about Earth data.
I'd be really interested in the differences, if any, between the kinds of questions this group is generating and the kinds of questions generated by that dip in the population at the undergraduate level where they don't ask questions.
Oh, Kenny, can you get me these questions afterwards? I can code them in our
Meta question.
taxonomy, and we can.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, that would be interesting.
And I'm surprised that about a third of the undergraduates basically didn't ask questions.
Let me clarify that afterwards.
Yeah.
Afterwards, I'll talk a little bit more about the methodology. Everybody that was asked to generate questions did generate questions.
It makes me think harder to come up with questions.
Okay, well, we have another fascinating collection of questions here. I appreciate everybody being willing to generate questions and share their questions. So now I'm going to ask you to change your hat once again. You've just been pretending to be participants in our study, and now we're going to change to being researchers on our research team and coding some of these data examples. So this was part of our effort towards our first research question, which was what kinds of questions do students generate as they view unfamiliar data visualizations. And to grapple with this question, we needed vocabulary, we needed some terminology with which to talk about kinds of questions. So we developed, well, we talked to linguists and we looked at previous taxonomies of question types that had been generated, none of which that we found pertain particularly well to questions around data. So we ended up generating a taxonomy of our own, and I'll share some parts of that with you now. So the first category was, it's not a question, basically. Either they just wrote down the title without writing a question, or they wrote something like, some features were not working for me, or there were a few that simply were not categorizable. They were such idiosyncratic questions, they fit nowhere in our taxonomy, and they got dumped in this not categorizable category. Then we had questions that were about the app itself, about the iPad app, the tool. Like, is there a way to easily navigate to another time interval? And not very many of those, but a few. Then the final two categories were the ones that we'll really be focusing on in the study. The first was questions about the data or the data representation. And the other big category was questions about the Earth. So the distinction there is the question fundamentally about the image that's on the screen in front of me, or the numbers behind that image, or the thing that's in the computer? Or is the question fundamentally about stuff that's out there in the Earth, stuff that's out there in the real world? Processes about questions about Earth processes or Earth structures or interactions between humans and Earth. Questions about what's out there versus questions about what's in here in the data. Questions about the human artifact that we call the data and the data representation, or questions about the Earth. And I'm really happy to say that in the questions that came across the chat, we have lots of good examples of both, so that we'll be able to do this next step of the webinar successfully. So we're first going to look at questions that are about the data or the data representation. And we had 4 subsets within that. So the first is what we call please explain questions. So these are questions where basically the participant was puzzling over what it was they were seeing. Like, what does it mean when the ocean gets more and more red? They really fundamentally don't understand something fundamental about what they're looking at. What do the symbols mean? What do the colors mean? What do the lines mean? What am I looking at? After that comes a set of questions about how was the data collected, determined, or processed, or measured? How did those scientists get these numbers out of the real world? And then, having gotten those numbers out of the real world, what did they do with them? How did they process and manipulate them in order to make the visualization that I'm seeing in front of me? So, for example, how do scientists measure the intensity of a hurricane? Anything about how the data was collected, some things about the limitations of the data or the sensors would go in here. Next is, why is this data type important? Why is this data type included in something that's supposed to be telling me about sea level? Or what would anybody ever do with this kind of data? Why would anybody ever collect this kind of data? And then a final category, which we hadn't anticipated but emerged from the data itself, was about the graphic representation. So that has to do with not why is the Earth the way it is, but why did you display it the way you did? Like for the hurricane, these are all genuine student questions, by the way, that emerged in response to the images that you saw. So for the hurricane graphic visualization, is there a better way to visualize this data? It looks like someone vomited on the map. So anyway, these get lots of criticisms of our graphic representation. So anyhow, so I would like you now to plunge back into your memory of the questions that you generated during our question generating activity and see if you had questions that were of any of these data categories. And if you think you've got a question that you can code into one of these data categories and are willing to share it, could you type the question and how you think it might be coded into the chat? I know you weren't writing down your questions, so you'll have to rummage back into your memory, but if you can do it, let's try it.
Do you want this asked over the chat, or do you want this by audio?
Let's try it in the chat, just so that everybody gets a chance to give it a try. Then we'll discuss some of them. How are these data being used? How many scientists? How collected? Okay. The chat gives me a sense about how possible people are finding this.
I find I can scroll through the chat and just copy items.
So I'm going to offer some of the comments on the things that are showing up in the chat. What do the colors indicate is a really clear, strong, clear example of what we put into the please explain category. So thank you, Beth. Are the data accurate geospatially north to south, as accurate geospatially north to south and east to west? So that is a good example of how was the data collected, determined, processed, measured. There's a 19-page coding set of directions as to how to do the coding here with examples. So you're not getting the full glory of the coding system here. Were you to see that, you would see that questions about accuracy or precision of the data, questions about the quality of the data, questions about what factors or parameters or instances are included or excluded in calculating indices, those are all squeezed into this. How was the data collected, determined, processed, measured? So that's how we would have coded that as well. Let's see, another how collected. Are these measures of atmospheric temperatures, sea surface temperatures, or some combination? Probably that would have gotten coded that way. Let's see. How was it collected? How much of this visualization is based on empirical data and how much is an extrapolation? So yes, questions about data quality, that would be all under how is the data collected. Then we have, is this a question about the Earth? Does this look basically the same each year? And there was another question about variability. And we made a distinction as best we could, although, as you know, it's not always easy to know what students had in mind. If we thought that the student was asking about variability in the Earth process, so in other words, how does air temperature vary from season to season or year to year or decade to decade, we would put that under the Earth category, which we'll dig into in a few minutes. If we thought it was basically about noise in the data or variability in the data that was introduced by the measurement process or imperfections of the data that were introduced by the measurement process, we would code it under data. And inevitably there were, hard calls where it was hard to understand exactly what was going on. We coded all of every questions. We had 604 questions that we ended up analyzing. They were all coded, double coded by myself and Melissa. And then we discussed them, all three of us, Melissa, Margie, and me, to come to a final conclusion. And of course, we had a preliminary coding sheet when we began, but it was an iterative process where early in the coding process, we found that we had to keep adding new categories or new clarifications to the coding schema as we went on. So
What about questions that ask about the meaning of the data?
the meaning of the data, let's see. If they were of the character of why would anybody care about this, we coded that as why important.
Sure.
If they were of the character of oh my God, does this mean we're all going to die? Or does this mean, what does this mean for whales? Or what does this mean? We characterize them as being about the Earth. And so there was a category related to that in the Earth. So conceptually, there's a fundamental dividing point between questions that are about the human artifact that we call data and questions that are about what's out there in the real world. It seems like a very clear dividing point, a split in the taxonomy. And generally speaking, it was quite clear. But every now and then you get this question, you're just scratching your head, like, what is this person asking about? Of course, if you were in a classroom situation, you could then engage them in dialogue and, tell me more about what you're wondering about. We couldn't do that in the study, but both are interesting. A student who's saying, why would anybody ever, spend ship time or satellite time or scientist time to collect this kind of data set? What would you ever do with that? Mm-hmm. That's worth knowing about. And a student who was saying, is this bad? Is this, does this mean the Earth is in trouble? Does this mean that Singapore's in trouble or whatever? That's a good kind of question too. So we tried to tell them apart. So I did not see anything fly by that struck me as a data question about why this graphic representation. There may have been one in here. It's not a particularly common type, but it's quite distinctive when you see it. So anyhow, you had lots of data questions. I felt as though you had more data questions. You had a lot of how is the data collected, determined, processed, measured questions when you were asked to ask what you would ask a scientist. Does anybody else have a data question that they particularly want to talk about? We could talk about one or two of them together if you want to ask a question out loud. Otherwise, we'll go on to the even more complicated coding category, which is questions that are about the Earth. And since we are geoscientists and the Polar Explorer app was created to help people think about the Earth, we got lots of questions about the Earth, so that was good. So what I'm going to do here is I will show you the whole portion of the taxonomy that deals with questions about the Earth. And then I'll introduce a couple of the subcategories that we'll use in trying to code the questions that you generated. The whole taxonomy itself is kind of overwhelming to do in a webinar context, but if anybody wants it, I'm happy to send it to you. So to start with, questions about the Earth. There were questions about causality. Why is the Earth the way it is? And questions about consequences. Given that the Earth is the way it is, what impact might that have on life, on humanity, on other physical systems? And then there were questions that were about relationships, where it was clear that a student was trying to relate what they were seeing in the map to something else, but we couldn't tell, or they didn't commit to whether or not they thought it was causality or consequences. So then there are questions about mitigation or adaptation or interventions. What steps might humans take to help with some problem that is emerging from this data set? And then there were questions where the person was basically asking a question that could not be answered with the data that was in hand. They were asking for data that was from some other time or some other place or some other data type that wasn't there. And then there were subcategories, many subcategories within each of those. We're going to dig deeper into some of the causality categories, the general category of consequences, and the general category of mitigation, adaptation, intervention. But you should just know that there are these other categories out there. Fortunately, there are many questions that came through in the chat that fall in the categories that I happen to have chosen to explore in more detail. So that's good. So let's first look at consequences. So a consequence question is where a person is saying, okay, you have shown me something about the Earth in this data. And now I would like to understand what that means. So, for example, you have shown me changes in the temperature of the ocean or changes in the temperature of the atmosphere. Is the heating of the ocean bad in small amounts and really bad in larger amounts? So what impact might that have? And does it scale with how much temperature change there is? So we also had categories of consequences that had to do with specifically what are the consequences for humans and human society? What are the consequences for other living beings? What are the consequences for other physical systems? We would have categorized this as a consequences question, an Earth question, a consequences question, but not specified what it referred to more specifically. So then, under given that some of these data then to a particular one that you saw, it was one that had mortality in it. So that would be mitigation, adaptation, intervention. And then there are a bunch of different kinds of coding categories about causality. Why is the Earth the way it is? And we'll look at a couple of them. The first is what controls this phenomenon? So you have shown me that something is happening in the Earth, and you've shown me that it's not the same everywhere. The map has different colors on it. This phenomenon is happening, and I want to know why. I want to know why it's happening, and I want to know why it's not the same everywhere. But they haven't plucked forth a particular phenomenon from the map that they're trying to explain. It's just like, explain this to me. Like, what causes hurricanes, or what causes hurricanes to be more intense in some places than in other places? They're not asking about a particular place or a particular time. They're just asking what causes this to happen and what causes it to vary. Then we have why. I'm seeing a spatial pattern, or I'm seeing a spatial trend, and help me understand why that spatial pattern or that spatial trend exists. So it seems like more north, there are larger anomalies. This was in response to a temperature map. Why do you think this is? And then finally, there's another category that we call departure from model. And in that situation, the person is seeing something in the data, and for some reason it doesn't match what they might have expected to see. And they're saying, hey, why isn't this empirical data matching this mental model that I had? And they didn't say it in exactly those terms, but that's how we're interpreting it. They had in mind that a certain thing should be a certain way. It's not that way in the data, and they're wanting to know why. So when a scientist experiences that, that's a really important moment. That's a potential doorway to an important inquiry. So we thought that that was an important kind of question to ask. So an example would be, how are those blue cold spots still there despite everything else's temperature going up? So we had to read between the lines, as we often did, to infer that this student had the idea that we're experiencing global warming and therefore everything should be warming. And so they're saying, well, I thought everything would be warming. My mental model was everything would be warming. Why am I seeing in the data empirical locations where things are getting colder rather than warming? So anyway, so now I invite you to think back on the questions that you asked. See if you can identify questions that are about the Earth rather than about the data. And see if you can code any of your questions into any of these categories about the Earth. It may be that you've got a question that doesn't fit into any of the categories that I chose to highlight, but give it a try anyway. So if you can get this to work and you are willing to type your question and what you think might be the coding category into the chat, we can have some conversation about that when we have a few examples. So far people are mostly putting causes questions, which matches with our student data set. That was the most common kind. But I'm wondering if anybody's got a consequence or a mitigation, adaptation, intervention kind of question.
One is a consequence. Or no?
Oh, we have a consequence, yes.
Yeah.
We do have a consequence, yes. Okay, well, this was really interesting. Thank you very much for trying this. So we have a consequence question here, which is how red does it have to get in Siberia to melt all the permafrost? How bad would that be? So the data has told us that the Earth is warming, and the consequence question would be, how will that affect the physical system of permafrost, and how bad would that be? So that's cool. There's a lot of spatial patterns and trends questions. And so that tends to be the case for these map-based questions. One interesting thing we could talk about at the end would be what kinds of data would draw forth more temporal patterns and trends type questions. So let's see. I noticed the massive track shows a distinct shape that seems to repeat and be reflected across the equator, and wonder why. That's a really classic spatial pattern or trend kind of a question. I do know the answer, by the way. You don't get hurricanes at places where the Coriolis force is low. So you don't form hurricanes near the equator. So that's why there's that band along the equator with no hurricanes, which is so interesting and distinct.
It's because it can't figure out which way to go.
That's right. It can't figure out which way to go. That's right. So there was another question about a temporal pattern, or a spatial pattern or trend question, which is about why there are fewer earthquakes and fewer hurricanes in the South Atlantic than in the other oceans. And that question turns out to be a very poorly understood question. There's some hypotheses, but it turns out that that is truly a question at the frontiers of science. Let's see. What causes the temperature to drop over the past 5 years over parts of Antarctica? Probably would code that as, again, Earth, causality, salient feature rather than spatial pattern or trend. Let's see. Yeah, you're getting it. This is working. So thank you very much. So as you might expect, there were many questions that we sort of had to agonize over, and we did end up inventing a few new coding categories early in our process. But by and large, if we look at the full coding, the full suite of categories, this is our full set of categories. And one thing we didn't talk about was Earth causality process mechanism hypothesis. That was another strong kind of question. And there are some in here that we would have put into that category. Let's see. Off the coast of Eastern North America is one patch that is staying even in terms of temperature. Does this align with the Gulf Stream? So probably we would have coded that as process mechanism hypothesis because although they didn't say that explicitly, the question asker seems to be putting forth the beginning of a hypothesis that this is related to this other phenomenon. Let's see. Why does there seem to be a temperature gradient from south to north? That's a classic example of spatial pattern or trend. Anyway, so you got a bit of a feel of what it was like to be a participant in our study, what it was like to be part of our team trying to code these questions. And I think the taxonomy is one of the most important outcomes for our project because it gives us a vocabulary with which to have conversations about is this working or not working? Are we actually helping students generate a wider range of different kinds of questions? Because now we have a vocabulary to talk about what constitutes a wider range of kinds of questions. So what I'm going to do now is go back into webinar presenter mode and tell you some of the findings from our study. And then after that, we have a few suggestions for educators and a few suggestions for curriculum for researchers. And then I hope that we might have time for some more sort of free-form conversation about what kinds of classroom interventions could educators and curriculum designers come up with that might increase the likelihood that more students would generate more questions, and in particular, better questions. So here is a summary of the breakdown of the kinds of questions that we got and how many we saw of each kind. So the large category of non-categorizable is mostly people who put down the map title and didn't write a question. We told them to do that. That's what most of these grays are. We got very few questions about the tools. And so our study focused primarily on the 604 questions that were coded as either being about the data or about the Earth. The Earth questions were the most abundant, but there was a healthy selection of questions about the data. And the width of each bar in this alluvial diagram is proportional to how many questions were generated across all the question asking conditions. I forgot to mention when I was talking about our methodology that all the participants saw both map sets and all the participants saw experienced both prompts. But any given participant saw only either the iPad app or the atlas, not both. The presentation of the map sets and the prompts were counterbalanced so that we got all combinations in all orders.
Do you think that people who are asking about the data as opposed to asking about Earth are are they asking about the data because they need more evidence in order to find it believable, whereas the people who are asking about the Earth kind of, they grok the data, they say, oh, okay, I get it. Oh, so it's more about what does it mean?
That is an interesting question. In general, most participants asked some of each kind of question. There were some people who were just really focused on the data, and they asked almost all data questions, and other individuals who were focused on the Earth, and they asked Earth questions. We did not try to distinguish by person attribute, like science majors versus non-science majors. We could have done that. Our sample's a little small to be doing that, but we could have done that. But in general, most people ask some of each.
Yeah.
And it's not that the data questions were unsophisticated. The data questions and the Earth questions were the more sophisticated questions. That wasn't the case at all. There were very, very simple data questions like what is red, and there are very sophisticated data questions, asking about the sensitivity of the sensors that were used to collect the data and other kinds of things like that. So I think that both data questions and Earth questions, or if you want to think more broadly than just geosciences, we also call them referent questions, questions about the thing of which the data is a representation. So I think that both the Earth questions and both the data questions and the referent questions have an important role to play in teaching and learning with data.
Yeah.
And they all range in quality. I do have some things to say later on about what kinds of circumstances brought forth those two different kinds of questions, as opposed to what kinds of people brought forth those two different kinds of questions, which we didn't look at. So, okay, so lots of questions to look at. So our second question was, what factors influence the nature of the kinds of questions that students generate? We looked at the number of questions that they generated under different circumstances. We looked at the focus of the questions. So the focus of the questions means which taxonomic categories were more emphasized under different circumstances. And then we worked at trying to understand something about the quality of the questions. That's the toughie. I'll tell you what we did and what we found, but that certainly needs more thought. Okay, so first, the focus of the questions. How does the focus of the questions vary depending on the prompt? And we have lots of fine print about this. I just plucked out a few things to point out to you that I thought might be intriguing. Remember that the choices of prompt are ask as many questions as you can versus the questions that you would like to ask the scientists. And we found that the particular taxonomic category of data, how was data collected, determined, processed, or measured, varied greatly depending on the prompt. And in particular, the Ask a Scientist prompt elicited far more questions that we coded as how was data collected, determined, processed, and measured. And interestingly enough, that matches the behavior of you guys. On our second pass-through, where this was our prompt, you generated a higher ratio of data questions to Earth questions than you did on our first prompt. And that was true across our participants as well. And that's very strategic, I think, on the part of these students. They understood that if they actually had access to these scientists, this is the kind of question that the scientists would be useful for. This is the kind of question that would be hard to just look up and relatively constructive to engage the scientists. And, how did you do this? Where did you go? What kind of instruments did you use? And what kinds of assumptions did you make? And what did you leave out? And how did you process this data? So that was interesting, and we think that's probably significant. So then, how does the focus of question vary depending on the content? In other words, what's the map about? And recall that we had one set of maps about why does sea level rise, and another set of maps about who's vulnerable to sea level change. And for many of our taxonomic data types, it didn't make much difference, but for some, there was a difference that makes sense and seems meaningful. First of all, in the Earth causality, spatial pattern or trend category, the percent of questions elicited by that map set, 13% of those questions were coded into this category in the maps about sea level rise, while only 3% were in the who's vulnerable. So the map set about why does sea level rise was very sciencey and had lots of strong spatial patterns in it. And so that makes sense, fits together with what we know about the data types. On the other hand, if you're more interested in Earth mitigation, adaptation, intervention, maps about who's vulnerable to sea level change were more likely to bring forth that. Oh, I forgot to mention when I had the alluvial diagram up showing how many questions we got in each data type. We didn't really get very many questions about mitigation, adaptation, intervention, and that was kind of disappointing, especially since we had an entire map set about who's vulnerable to sea level change. There's been a sort of a sea change in teaching about the Earth in recent years to put more focus on teaching Earth concepts in the context of societal issues. And that did not come out very strongly. This was not a strong, a well-developed set of questions. There were not that many questions. However, by providing maps about who's vulnerable to sea level change, that brought forth more questions in this category. Okay, so this being Concord Consortium, the home of interactive technology-aided instruction, I thought you would want to know about the difference between the static and interactive versions. And if truth be told, there wasn't a whole lot of difference. So this is the whole data set. We have the whole data set for all these other things as well, but I've just picked out a few things to show you. And truthfully, so the atlas, the paper atlas, is in the lighter shade, and the iPad app is in the darker shade. And there's really no taxonomic categories for which there is a strong preference where you get lots more questions in the interactive version than you do in the static version. There's some where there's a little bit of difference, but it's really hard to get excited in my mind about any of those, basically.
What are the errors?
Pretty similar.
I mean, if the numbers are small, if you put in errors, that'd be pretty...
That's right, exactly.
So this is all pretty much within...
I'm saying it's pretty much within. The only one that might be worth paying attention to actually favors the atlas rather than the app, which is spatial patterns and trends. I think basically there's not a whole lot of difference.
With that many variables, one of them is likely to stand.
That's exactly right. That's why we chose not to do a search for significance, because there's so many of them.
Just want to point out.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Yeah.
The reason there were fewer questions about spatial pattern trends is because those patterns and trends were clearer with the app than in the atlas. So they didn't have as many questions about that. Just devil's advocate here.
Possibly. We also thought, well, first of all, let me say that an atlas is a pretty high bar if you're going to be testing interactivity versus static. People love atlases. I could stare at an atlas for hours, So in other words, this paper atlas is pretty attractive, and it's pretty intriguing. And for a test of interactive versus static, an atlas, as I said, is a pretty high bar. We thought we talked about that spatial pattern or trend thing, and did we want to think it was significant or not? And we thought that a possibility was that the first page of the atlas on any new data type is always the global, and the spatial patterns show up very well on that. Whereas in the interactive, if you go right into the interactive mode and you zoom into a smaller area, the spatial patterns in some ways are less distinctive. So we thought that might be it. But truthfully, there's not a whole lot of difference. I mean, the bottom line is that the static and the interactive did not show a particular difference, and you cannot make a case that interactivity generated new kinds of...
The big thing one big thing anyway about showing data on a computer in a dynamic way versus on paper is that you can show trends over time. Mm-hmm. Did you do that? Did you have that map, for example, of the temperature distribution? Yeah. You say this is the temperatures, whether it went up or down over the last 5 years. But it might be interesting to take a 5-year window and look at that as a function of time. Yeah. And that would be much harder to do on the atlas because you have to compare different pages.
That's right. We did have that. So both the web version and the iPad version, not for the data set that I showed you, but for many other data sets, allows you to step through time. Mm-hmm. We don't have time series as graphs, but we have multiple maps that you can step through time. And for the ocean data sets, many of the ocean data sets, you can also step down through space so that you are seeing the sea surface temperature, and then you're seeing 50 meters down, and then 100 meters down, and 200 meters down, and 500 meters down. So there was that interactivity. We tried to approximate that in the atlas by showing those on different pages.
Yeah.
But of course, we had to pre-choose which pages which levels we were going to show in space, or which time intervals we were going to show in time. And you don't have that sense of agency of, I can choose what interval of time we want. So we did have that capacity. And temporal pattern or trend. So temporal pattern or trend is in the causality section there. And not many questions were generated about temporal pattern or trend, although that capacity was there. And to the extent that there's a difference, there were more on Atlas, but again it's trivial.
It's no difference in no difference.
That's right. You should call that no difference. Yeah.
This is Rob, but I was kind of struck by the fact that in the interactive version, the menu items were themselves questions. And I wondered if that influenced, I mean, it's hard for me to think that that didn't influence people somehow, either by signaling which were appropriate questions to ask, or giving more information about the category of problems you'd be headed into.
That is a really interesting point, and I will comment, but then I'll ask Margie if she wants to comment as well. So I was not involved in developing the app, but the people who were did that very consciously. They used the questions as a lure, as an entree point to pull people in. And the research component was added to the project later on for some kind of odd idiosyncratic reasons that people who've been engaged with NSF over the last 5 years might understand. And certainly when we were trying to think through this research question, the fact that the project itself already had this focus around questions fed into our decision that what we wanted to research here was question asking. And but we didn't look specifically to see whether or not the nature of the questions that were in the menu bar was echoed in the students' questions. We didn't look at that specifically, but that's kind of an interesting point. Margie, are you still on? Do you have anything further to say about having the menu items be questions?
I am still on, and it was definitely a very conscious decision on our part. When we first started talking the app itself, we wanted to set it up much like a book with different chapters, and you'll see that it is structured that way with big theme questions and then smaller categories underneath them. And really, we wanted to mimic the scientists who ask questions all the time, and then they, go out to seek answers to those questions. As well as, I think in the backs of our minds, we were also aware that the whole question of what's going on with the Earth right now and what is really happening seems to be a question in and of itself. So it just tended to lead itself that direction.
Thanks. Yes?
So the question about why nobody asked temporal pattern questions got me thinking about, there's a whole bunch of other pieces there where nobody asked questions. And most of those, you could make the case, require a much deeper understanding of the data.
Yeah.
So the temporal questions require you to digest this in 4 dimensions instead of 3.
Yeah.
And
I also found, it was interesting that this was sort of put as a comparison between interactive and paper, because I expected when I went to the interactive to actually have more kinds of interactive features. Like zoom and pan to me didn't feel like it really added any more information than I had on the paper.
I disagree though, because I found I would see trends on the big scale. I mean, that it was zoomed out, and when I zoomed in, I would see that they weren't really trends, but I wasn't able to resolve the details very well. So it would kind of drop questions I had would be answered by zooming in.
Can you give an example of something like that?
Yeah, I thought I saw, like in the Pacific, I thought I saw like this vertical line of storms kind of going up. But when I zoomed in, it was actually lines going in many different directions that from a distance seemed to be like a solid vertical trend, but wasn't really a trend at all.
The different data types have different different levels of resolution and therefore different levels to which you can delve in. So the sea surface temperature, for example, you can zoom in and in and in, and you keep seeing, more levels of interest. The hurricane data tracks, you don't have that level of interactivity to it.
If you don't mind, if I could just add one thing. So interactivity, you can actually touch on the surface of the map, whether it's in an iPad or actually on your computer screen, and you can bring up data points, which you cannot do in an atlas. So you can judge what the temperature is by looking at the color scheme, but you can't actually touch on a specific area and pop up that information. And we didn't look at many of these maps, but there are some where, as Kim was saying, you can literally dive down in the ocean and look at temperature differences as you go down and see some of these kind of really intriguing phenomena, whereas you go down in the center of the ocean, it gets colder. If you go down closer to Greenland, it actually gets warmer. So, those kinds of things are really much more available to you in the interactive one.
Yeah, so I guess I didn't see those in the maps that we were.
Yeah, I chose maps that I thought would work in the, just seeing it in the Zoom version as well as in the interactive version. But there's tons more really fascinating things in these data sets to explore. And if you want to explore further on your own, something that might not have been really obvious, but there's a little eye in a circle on each screen, which will bring you to information about how was the data collected and what does the data mean in some cases. So one of our puzzles in trying to do this work was trying to figure out we have this sort of intuitive sense that some questions are more useful than other questions, but how on earth do you assign any kind of a quality value to a question? And we wanted a quality value not just for an individual question, but for a cluster of questions, because there's this idea of, a line of questions. These questions are related to each other. And you can have one person who sits there and looks at something and looks and looks and looks and comes up with one good question. And then you can have another person whose mode of thinking is to just spew out question after question after question, and then, somehow or another pick out the best. And so we've got students with lots of questions in response to one prompt and one map set, and students with few questions. And so we wanted a way to judge the quality of individual questions, but then of a question set. So all the questions that a given student generated in response to a given map set and a given prompt using a given medium. So we went round and round in circles on this for quite a long time. We tried a lot of different approaches. In the end, we settled on a methodology that is built on Bloom's levels. We initially had a different coding scheme that we invented, but it wasn't all that much better, and so we went with this this cognitive hierarchy that would be familiar to at least some of our readers. Through a complicated iterative process, we assigned a Bloom's level to each question type of our taxonomy. So here are some examples of how our taxonomic types fit into the Bloom's hierarchy. So we found nothing at the lowest Bloom's level of remember, because although many of the questions involve remembering some piece of information, like the equator is where it's the warmest, to generate a question involved combining the remembered information with something else, so that bumped it up out of the simplest level. So at the understand level, data, please explain. Please tell me what red means. Please explain to me what, I don't understand what dots mean. I don't understand what lines mean. At the highest level, this category of Earth causality departure from model requires actually creating a connection where none was there before between a mental model that you bring from your prior knowledge and some information that's on the map in front of you. So And all of our other taxonomic categories got placed into one of these Bloom's levels.
But to
And
judge
then-
that create thing,
Yep,
you have to have a sense of what their mental model was.
that is true.
And I mean, not everybody will have the same. But one assumes, I guess, for the temperature distribution again, that the simple mental model is that when the Earth heats up, it all heats up uniformly.
Well,
and therefore the differences strike you.
Yep.
But that's going to be true. That's not exactly creative. That's simply looking at. That could also be just, gee, I see lots of different colors here.
If I see lots of different colors, if it's gee, I see lots of different colors here, would have been coded as
it's got at the bottom, presumably. It's
that's
a
right.
representation.
That would have been
of
coded
confidence.
as Earth causality, what controls phenomenon, which is coded at a lower level, and I can tell you what level it's coded at. I think it's coded at, just a sec, Earth causality. Earth causality. What controls phenomenon is coded at understand. So,
Yeah,
how
so
come
very
it's all
low
different
level.
colors would be coded as Earth causality, what controls phenomenon, and that would be coded at the understand level.
And yet it could be reflective of somebody at a very high level who's simply using the language, but it's an understood language that these colors, I do understand they represent different temperatures, and I don't understand why Antarctica is getting colder while everybody else is getting warmer. I mean,
That's true. And, were we sitting around the table at Lamont with at the cafeteria with a bunch of physical oceanographers, we might have made that inference, but these were undergraduates. So in the simplest case, they would tell us, the question would say, well, I must have expected blah, 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 but I'm seeing blah, blah, blah. That's clear and clean and easy to code. Yeah. Coding student utterances and student writings is always, got a bit of an art to it. And we insisted to put something in this category. We insisted that there be something explicit in their words that told us what they would have expected. Mm-hmm. So one of the examples that came through here seemed to be conveying this idea that, why isn't it all getting warmer? Yeah. I would have expected it to be all getting warmer, but there's this place that's getting colder. Mm-hmm. So that we would have coded in this category. Yeah, but if they're just kind of puzzled, they're just saying, if they're just saying, I don't know why this is the way it is, then it would have been coded in the simpler categories of causality, either what controls phenomenon, or temporal pattern or trend, or spatial pattern or trend. If they presented the beginnings, the glimmerings of a hypothesis or a mechanism or a process, that's another category that would have been at the high level coded, because again, they have to make a connection, they have to create a connection between something they're seeing in the data and something they know about the Earth. So we thought that was at a higher level. So this is hard, this whole part about putting qualities on questions or groups of questions, really hard, but really important, because if we care about helping students generate better questions, we need to be able to articulate and defend what in fact is a better question. So then the next question was, how do we indicate the quality of a cluster of a set of questions? And in the end, we did that by tallying the number of questions in a question set that fell within the top 3 Bloom's levels. We considered a lot of other different methodologies, and none was fully satisfactory, but we ended up with this, which did seem to be distinguishing between questions that you can think of as kind of stepping stone questions that are absolutely essential. You really do have to find out what red means or what spots mean or what lines mean to go forward. And you really do need to think through these earlier level questions, but it was these higher level questions that we thought had the potential in a science context to lead to a meaningful inquiry, or in the self-guided learning situation to lead to truly deeper understanding about an idea that a topic you were trying to learn about. So that's how we did it. Let's see. Okay, so then what did we find out? This is the whole data set. coded by Bloom's level, by question quality. So each vertical bar represents one participant, and the height of the bar is how many questions they asked altogether. So they had 10 minutes on each map set, 20 minutes total. So that means they were asking in the neighborhood of a question every minute or half a question every minute. But there was lots of variability from an individual who asked only 6 questions in the whole study to somebody else who's at 36 questions in the whole study. Lots of variability. However, within that variability, and the colors indicate the Bloom's level, with the create being the highest and understand being the lowest. We found that almost everybody generated at least one question in the top 3 Bloom's level. You know, science majors, non-science majors, freshmen, seniors, people from you know, the highest end universities there are to be found in Cambridge, to people at, you know, much less prestigious institutions.
And anybody with a light green strip,
yeah,
would be there.
Anybody with light green, yellow, or orange would have generated at least one question in the
You have to have light green before you get to yellow.
Well, some people,
could you skip? I guess you could.
You could
skip a level, but I don't see it.
You could. Let's see. Well.
Oh yeah, there's one in the middle.
There's some.
There's the third one from the left.
There's a pretty wide range of variability. So what we're seeing is that students have widely varying question generating ability. 70% of these students generated at least one question at the highest level. However, at the other end, almost everybody generated at least one question at the understand level. So, you know, these data sets, some of the data sets were pretty confusing and pretty arcane, and pretty much everybody in this population had at least one question of the flavor, I do not understand what I am looking at, you know, explain to me what I'm seeing so that I can, you know, go forward.
You need a ratio of the quality of the data visualization with the quality of question, because if the data visualization quality is poor, then an understand question is excellent.
That's true. So it's not, there's 2 dimensions. One is the quality of the data visualization, and the other is the familiarity of the phenomenon.
Right.
So there's some pretty...
Boy, we could dive in and have a great time.
We could. There's some pretty arcane data types in here that are pretty hard to understand, outgoing radiation and other kinds of things, and the little short explanation might not have been enough to, you know, get people up to speed to the point that they could have any prayer of anything beyond a please explain question. So, anyways, that was interesting. This shows...
What you do have in that previous slide is it's pretty clear, just from looking at it for 5 minutes, that there are distinct profiles.
Definitely. Yep.
I mean, some of these kids skip Bloom levels, you know, they jump from one level, whatever. Some of them never get to particular levels. There's a certain, if you had more data, you know, you do this again now with 10,000 students, you might be able to categorize students according to not a single question. I mean, it starts with a question, but then the pattern of the way they answer the questions, there is some variance there.
There's no question about that. And the way we coded the questions, we took a set of questions together. So the questions that were made by a given individual in response to a given map set and a given prompt, and we coded them all together because sometimes one question feeds into the next question.
Yeah.
And you know, the only way to understand the 7th question is to understand what they asked as their 6th and their 5th question, and then you can understand what they're talking about. So we did them as a clump. And there's no question that some of those people, wow, I'd really like to meet this person. This person's asking really interesting questions. And then there's some other people, oh, this person's so annoying. You know, and so there's definitely characters of question asking that come through when you're reading the individual questions that you only get a glimmer of when you look at this. But nonetheless, you detected that glimmer. You know, the person with only the blue and green questions, you know, that's definitely a different person than the person with the full range of questions.
Yeah, the most salient thing is how many questions they ask, but that's not the interesting thing. The interesting thing is the bands of the color bands.
That's right.
And the missing ones, and the ones that are bigger or smaller.
Yeah, there is a tendency for the people who ask the most questions to be the people who ask the most good questions.
Mhm.
And we did look at that in several different ways. I didn't I didn't include those slides, but if you're looking for a lot of questions at the light green, yellow, and orange, by and large, you find those people at the more questions asked end of the scale. You know, there is that person down there in the third bar who asks a lot of creative questions out of only 8 questions total. So that can be done. But looking across the sweep of the data, if you're looking for lots of questions, if you're looking for high quality questions, the place to look is in the people who ask lots of questions. That actually fits.
It'd be interesting to try this out with faculty members in the geosciences or in other fields, and then mix and match. And here's a pattern. Which one do you think it is? Kind of thing.
Well, let's
I wonder
see.
if there are any differences.
A colleague of ours took our coding scheme and applied it to the questions that were asked in seminars at in a geoscience department. So that would have been scientists and graduate students.
Those are professionals.
She found that first of all, the coding scheme worked, so that was really reassuring. She was able to code the questions according to this taxonomy and didn't struggle any more than we struggled. So that was good. And that there were more higher order questions than we got amongst the student population. So that's a very, you know, this is
at least it didn't go the other way.
Yeah, it didn't go the other way. So that was kind of cool. So she just did that spontaneously, and I thought that was fabulous, fascinating. So anyway, so students do differ a lot, and there is a question asking personality, as you began to detect in here. There's a profile. The word used was profile. A question asking profile. Different students have different question asking profiles, and so, you know, how do we make
what do you do with that?
question asking profiles get better? So let's
Most
see.
common color it appears is the dark green, I think.
That's true. Yep.
Every single person has dark green.
Every single person has dark green. Dark green has the most categories that got coded into dark green. So we set up the taxonomy first.
So that's not fair then.
That's not fair, right?
Okay.
So we set up the taxonomy first, and we looked at focus. And meanwhile, we were trying to develop a quality indicator that we believed. And so quality came along much later.
Okay.
And so the mapping from our initial taxonomy into Bloom's levels was kind of complicated and iterative, but it generated the most taxonomic categories at the apply level. So yes, that's why there's the most greens. But questions from out there in webinar land? I'm answering.
I think I see one question at the bottom, if you see it. On your chat.
Oh, yes. Are you viewing this hierarchy as leaning towards a learning progression? Yes, but we're not very close. I mean, ultimately, if we think that question asking is good and important, we would like to be able to know how to instruct towards it, and doing so requires that we have some idea of what a sequence would be that gets us there. So that's, you know, that's leading towards a learning progression. But let me say that I feel that it's a little bit different than many other learning progressions, because everybody has to start over again at the base of the learning progression when they encounter a new data type. So if I, you know, encounter a data type in, you know, particle physics or some other field that I have no training in whatsoever, I have to start with please explain questions. You know, please tell me what the axes mean. Please tell me what the dots mean. And so I revert to stage one of this data questioning learning progression all over again when I come into a field as a novice. So that's interesting. It means that all of us can at least find it in our hearts to have any that's happened to us when we go to a field in which we're not experts.
I think that's an interesting observation, because I think we also often find in instruction when we have somebody doing something that they're unfamiliar with, that it's really nice to, in contrast to what you were saying, go back a few Piaget levels and become really concrete or something like that.
Yep.
And so maybe this is not as different as maybe you might think.
Oh, that could be. That could very well be. I think it's maybe easier to realize that that's happening with data than it might be in another field, but it may pertain to all learning progressions, in fact. Interesting. So let's see.
I'd like to draw attention to the fact that we just have 10 minutes left.
Okay. I have just a couple more things to say, and then I will let Natalia come back and talk about the future webinars and so forth. Thank you for reminding me. So this shows the number of questions generated in response to the 2 prompts. And I alluded to this earlier when we were looking at the previous slide, that when you're looking for high-level questions, a place to look at them is in individuals who ask a lot of questions. And we see the same thing coming out when we compare our 2 prompts. So the many questions prompt elicited more questions in the top 3 Bloom's level than the Ask a Scientist prompt, which was interesting. But it also elicited more questions in the lowest Bloom's level. So we thought that perhaps the students were self-censoring and trying not to ask stupid questions when given the opportunity to talk to a scientist. We don't know that for sure, it's just a hypothesis, but it is true at both the level of the corpus of questions as a whole and at the level of individuals that asking many questions appears to be the pathway to ask many good questions. I had just a few things to say about our last research question. Does the activity of question generating increase students' level of engagement with the data or attitudes towards the data? So there was one question on the evaluators' post survey that asked, what did you find most memorable about today's activity? And so we have some qualitative information that for at least some of the students, the question asking was a memorable aspect of the activity. So I enjoyed, and they're telling us in their own words that I enjoyed actively thinking about the questions. It had me think more about than just looking. In fact, I heard one of you say that while you were doing the question asking. I really liked the question activity. It made me engage with the maps more. And I wouldn't have looked at them or thought about them in the same way if I hadn't been told to essentially think critically about them. So that was good. So that was 3 students' answers out of all of our 41 question asking students. But when we tried to capture this finding quantitatively, we didn't find it. So one of the things we asked trying to get this was they had a post-activity question. What time was up in today's activity, which represented how you felt. I was already bored. I was beginning to lose interest. Or I was really enjoying what I had been doing and wished that I could have had more time with the activity. And so very promising from the point of view of this particular app or from the point of view of teaching and learning with data in general, 51% of the participants across all of the conditions selected, I was really enjoying what I was doing and wished I could have had more time with the activity. So that was good. However, there was no significant difference in question asking versus non-question there. There was no further added value of having the students ask questions as opposed to not ask questions in terms of their level of engagement with the activity. And then we had a complicated question. This was on the pre and post surveys. If you were trying to convince a friend to agree with your views about climate change, which of the following approaches would you try? This followed after a whole long series of questions about their attitudes, about what they believed about the climate change causes and climate change consequences. So they had to select which of a collection of statements best matched their own ideas or beliefs. And so then following that, we added this new question saying, if you were trying to convince a friend to agree with your views, regardless of what those views were, but they had just been reminded about what their views were by the preceding questions, which of the following approaches would you try? And so then we had a whole bunch of options for each of which they could say, I wouldn't use it, I might use it, or I would definitely use it. So first, explain in your own words your reasons for having that view about causes. Similarly, explain in your own words your reasons for having that view about consequences. So that's intended to elicit the idea of peer persuasion. The next two were show your friend an article or video in which a scientist speaks about causes, or a scientist speaks about consequences. So this was intended to elicit the idea of appeal to authority. And then the final choices were show your friend data maps and graphs that illustrate causes or consequences, data maps and graphs. And so they could choose any of these. So what we're going to look at in the data is the percentage of participants choosing would definitely use. And first we'll look at pre-activity and then post-activity, pre in blue. So pre-activity, there wasn't that much difference, but data maps and graphs was the least likely to be chosen by all the participants when on the causes of climate change questions, and data maps and graphs was the least likely to be chosen on the consequences. So they're much more likely to either try to use their own words to persuade through their own reasoning, or to appeal to authority through an article or video before they engage with the set of maps. However, afterwards, the situation had reversed. And so afterwards, on the causes questions, they're most likely to show their friend data maps and graphs. And on the consequences questions, they're most likely to show their friend data maps and graphs. And the difference between data maps and graphs pre and data maps and graphs post is a significant difference. So the activity of working with these maps, either in the atlas or in the app, did change their likelihood to rely on, or at least use data maps and graphs in trying to persuade someone about causes and consequences of climate change. However, once again, there was no difference between question asking and non-question asking. So working with data from the point of view of this group of people who care about having students engage with data was useful, but the question asking activity did not add any further value above and beyond the time spent exploring the data. So that's the end of my formal comments. We have just a couple, oh no, we have suggestions. So I will tell you a few of our suggestions. One is assign question generating and take the resulting products seriously. If you just sit back and wait for students to ask questions, anybody who's ever taught know that only a minority of students actually ask questions in most circumstances. But you can actually have that be an assignment and pay attention to the questions that the students come up with. Welcome all questions. We think that all the levels of our taxonomy, from the please explain up to the departure from model, all have a place in science education, and that students should be encouraged to ask questions at all levels, discouraged from self-censoring questions because they're stupid, encouraged to work their way up to the more cognitively demanding questions. And that the teachers should model the behavior about asking questions themselves about a data set that they are unfamiliar with, beginning with the please explain questions and working all the way up. And then finally, have students generate questions about data before you tell them what they should be seeing. These students, these participants, had not seen this data before. Many of the data were very obscure, and they wouldn't have seen them in the newspaper or in class or in school. And yet they were able to generate, pretty interesting, meaningful questions. So that was our questions. That was our thoughts for educators. With thoughts for researchers, which I'm going to skip over because I want to allow at least a very short amount of time. We just have a couple minutes left for questions or ideas, if anybody would like to share.
Well, I find myself wondering whether you could train a machine learning algorithm to classify questions, whether you have enough data already for that.
I don't think so. Certainly to get the 10,000 questions that Paul was asking for, we would have to have something like that because it's very labor intensive to code these by hand. I felt that, we coded 10% of the questions at a time. And even when we got up to coding session number 10, although by then we had a refined coding schema and by then we had lots of experience, there were still some questions we were struggling about. On the other hand, by then, there were some recurring questions, and I suspect that you could use some kind of a hybrid system where you could get an algorithm to code, half of them, or maybe working its way to more than half of them. So many reoccur, like what causes hurricanes, what causes these other different kinds of phenomena, and what does this word mean. So certainly you could have an automated coding system skim off the easiest of them, leaving the human coders to tear their hair out over the remaining ones.
I have a couple of takeaways. And a question that goes beyond the scope of what you were doing, but sounds interesting. One takeaway is, of course, that what you found in a nutshell is that from the point of view of the students' engagement and perhaps of their learning, that whether or not they asked questions wasn't terribly substantial. That didn't make a significant difference.
In the way we did it, which was fairly artificial. So yeah, I'm not convinced. In fact, I still, in my heart of hearts, believe that asking questions does increase engagement. I believe that, although we didn't see it in the particular way we had the experiment set up.
No, okay, I accept that. But I would argue that it's a good thing to do even if it doesn't increase engagement, because asking good questions is the essence of understanding stuff. Yeah. And one would assume, as with everything else, playing the bassoon or what have you, that doing it many times, you get better at it. The practice makes perfect.
That's right.
So asking questions from the point of view of the student, the effect on the student, is a good thing whether or not it increases engagement. Yep. Secondly, from the point of view of the teacher and or researcher who wants to understand what the student sees when he or she looks at a representation of data, or for that matter, and Frida and I have had this discussion, looks at a simulation in which they're interacting with stuff, but the stuff that they're interacting with may or may not be salient to them. They may not understand what they're doing when they interact, other than the fact that it reacts in certain ways. Asking questions of them is kind of a good way to find that out. So those are my two things. The future thing, though, is from the point of view of scientists, it's not just a question of being able to ask good questions in the sense that they're interesting questions. There has to be a methodology for finding out the answers. And that's the hard part. When you get to the stage of actually having to do a research plan around, how would you know? That's right. Especially in the social sciences, where it's almost impossible to do experiments. Yeah. But even in the physical sciences, it's not easy to ask questions that are amenable to experiment. Yeah.
So Paul, I'm going to answer that one question, and then I realize we're out of time. But I've got my email up here if you want to email me. I'm happy to answer more questions by email or by phone or Skype or however you want to interact. But we thought a lot about that, because although the literature on student question asking is fairly sparse, a big share of what there is has to do with how students can generate researchable questions. There's a big focus on researchable questions. And our opinion was that push is coming too soon.
It may be.
You end up with questions that are researchable but not meaningful. One of the papers that we read quoted a great example, which was the student science fair study experimenting on whether or not plants grow better when fed 7-Up or Coke. Yes, it is a researchable question, and yes, they collected data, and yes, they had a manipulated variable and a controlled variable. But what does that have to do with anything? How does that fit into the scientific enterprise at all? So by pushing students too early, too fast to come up with researchable questions, you prioritize researchability over meaning. And so our sense, again, growing partly from this study, but also from just years and years and years of hanging around scientists, is that scientists go through dozens or hundreds of questions before they settle on one that is researchable, and that you have to just work your way through a lot of inadequate questions before you get to one that really, really has the potential to yield a new insight at the frontiers of science. And so perhaps we ought to be encouraging more questions sooner later on. And then something outside of the bounds of our study is how then do you help students find the good ones amongst this collection of questions that they've generated. These folks who wrote the Make Just One Change book have a methodology that they think, that they say works.
You're not pointing at the.
Oh, there we go.
There you go.
Make Just One Change. It hasn't been researched, but they do have a methodology for encouraging students to create lots of questions. It's based on years of practitioners' observation that went into this book. But that would be a place to start. But I think it remains an unanswered question about. I think it's an unanswered question about how do scientists decide on what's the good question.
And not all of them do.
And not all of them do. And looking back over my own career, I can think of some big chunks of time that I spent working on questions that were not worth spending my time on.
Of course.
And I didn't even understand at that time that there were good questions and not so good questions. And I shouldn't be wasting time on certain questions that I wasted time on. So the idea that there's more generative questions and then stepping stone questions that you have to get through to get to the generative questions, I think is something that an idea that we could be trying to build quite early. I was post-PhD before I understood that. In fact, I may have been several years.
It's really a postdoc kind of thing.
Paul, thank you so much for your conversation. We really do have to wrap this up, so I'm going to go ahead.
Thank you all for coming and for sending in your questions. This was really fascinating.
Absolutely.
Bye.
Let me go ahead and just.
Should I stop sharing?
Go ahead.
Okay, I stopped sharing if you want to show the coming attractions.
All right, let's get ourselves there. Okay. So, again, everybody, thank you so much, especially for coming here and sharing your webinar with us. Thank you for joining us, everybody. It was just a fascinating discussion. And if you did not get to your question, or if you'd like to leave additional questions by Twitter or email, Kim has made herself very available. So feel free to also email us as well at codap@concord.org. We did not get to your question. Oh, sorry. And also just to mention that we had a lot of great interaction. I'm grateful to all of you for making such a rich discussion happen. And thank you, Kim, for facilitating that so well. We'll send you a link to the recorded session shortly and also more information about our future data science education webinars. Our next one is on April 17th with Danny Edelson, Audrey Mohan, and Emily Harris. And they'll be speaking to us about citizen science data in FieldScope, which sounds like a very intriguing project. You can sign up for our next webinar and future webinars at concord.org/meetup. You can also stay connected with us on Twitter at CodapDataSci. If you use the hashtag DataSciEd to tweet us any additional questions or resources that you'd like to share, we will be sure to respond to you. Please feel free to visit our website, codap.concord.org, to connect with us as well. Everybody, thank you all so much once again, and look forward to seeing you at our next webinar.
Bye-bye.